left the marina early with the outgoing tide in sunny blue skies and flat calm. Headed north on the Salish Sea. It's about 50 miles to the southern San Juan Islands from our marina. We go north through Admiralty Inlet, past Port Townsend, and then across the Straits the one to Fuca. Our trusty iron Genoa and the push of an outgoing tide moving us along at over 6 knots. We use this uninhabited island as our roughly halfway mark for crossing the Straits. From Port Townsend to Cattle Pass, it's about 25 miles across the Straits. We passed well west of Smith Island, avoiding the shoals on the island. Crossing the Straits of Juan de Fuca can be a punishing challenge, especially if the wind and current are opposed. But we were rewarded with flat seas, blue skies, and a small ocean swell. It was a remarkably flat and smooth crossing, and we tucked into McKay Harbor at the south end of Lopez Island. It had been a long day, and it felt good to finally be peacefully at anchor. After a peaceful night in McKay Harbor, we spent a few days visiting some of our favorite anchorages in the southern San Juan Islands. Every island and anchorage seems to have a completely different feel to it. It's amazing what a difference there can be in just a matter of a few miles. A really low tide exposes a few surprises on the beach. There's a few oysters. After a few days, it was time to reprovision. So we upped anchor and headed to Friday Harbor, where there's an excellent grocery store and marina, along with a lot of touristy shops and restaurants. Our tidal range can reach as much as 15 feet, although it averages in the 10 to 12 foot range. We typically anchor in 25 to 35 feet of water. It's always a good idea to be aware of the tides when determining the scope as you anchor. We're strong believers in all-chain roads and oversized anchors, but that's a good subject for another video. Most of the anchorages in the San Juan Islands offer good holding in mud bottoms and are fairly well sheltered. Many parts of the islands are state marine parks and offer mooring buoys, docks, and camping sites, along with lots of room to anchor. Expected to only spend one night in Friday Harbor, but the weather made an abrupt change from blue skies and sunny calm to heavy rain with thunder and lightning. This sort of weather is very unusual around here, but it seems like most of the world is getting unusual weather nowadays. We spent a second peaceful day below deck, listening to the rain, reading, and relaxing. Once the nasty weather had cleared, we headed north up the San Juan Channel to one of our favorite anchorages, Reed Harbor on Stewart Island. You know how you've been to a place or done something so many times that you just don't really give it a second thought? Well, I didn't bother to check the tides and currents before we headed out that day to go to Stewart Island. The Canadian Hydrographic Service produces a current atlas that covers the Straits of Fuca, Gulf Islands, San Juan Islands, and the Straits of Georgia. This atlas is an indispensable tool when cruising in these areas. The atlas shows the current direction and strength for every hour of every day. It's very simple to use. The bigger the arrow, the stronger the current, and the arrow is pointing in the direction that the current will be running. If I had looked at my current guide like I should have, I would have realized that we could have left an hour later and avoided all of this current that was on our nose. time we finally reached the north end of Speeden Island, the tide had changed, the current had subsided, and we were able to motor along quite comfortably at 5.5 to 6 knots again. Upon arrival in Reed Harbor, we picked up one of the state mooring buoys and then settled into the peaceful, quiet calm of this anchorage. Sometimes when you're out cruising, you run into relatives that you're not acquainted with, but they're definitely related. We woke up the next morning to find that rain had returned. Not the thunder and lightning heavy rain of a few days earlier, just the normal, gentle, peaceful Pacific Northwest type rain. These wet, rainy days are perfect for a nice, warm spot of tea for the Admiral and a cup of cocoa for the Captain. If I ever grow up, I'm going to learn how to drink tea and coffee maybe too. A day later, the rain was gone and the morning was dry with hints of sunshine. Perfect weather for a hike. It's a pleasant 2.5 mile hike from Reed Harbor to the Turn Point Lighthouse. We arrived at the Turn Point light station just in time for tide change. The strong tidal rips, overfalls, and whirlpools are very impressive. The current can exceed 5 knots at times. Often you can see whales and dolphins at Turn Point. There were some dolphins fishing in the overfalls, but unfortunately my camera was just not powerful enough to capture them. As we began our hike home, we had a bit of a surprise in a tree just above the path. Some threatening-looking clouds rolled in as we were making our return hike, and we were a little bit concerned that we might get wet before we got back to the boat. Fortunately, the clouds continued drifting east, and by the time we got to our dinghy, the sun was back out. Like all good things, this adventure was coming to an end. We hadn't gotten to do a lot of sailing. Basically, weather was pretty calm and flat. But we did find a little bit of wind as we turned and started to head south. We were able to sail for a few hours at least. We decided to return home via what's locally known as the Inside Route, across Rosario Strait to Padilla Bay, and down the Swinomish Channel to Skagit Bay. As we were approaching Anacortes and Padilla Bay, we saw a very unusual sight. We see ferries all the time here in the Salish Sea, but this is the first time I've ever seen one sitting up in dry dock. Depending on the strength of the current, it typically takes about 2 hours to motor the length of the Swinomish Channel. Logs are a constant nuisance when traveling in the Salish Sea. Fortunately, in calm conditions like this, they're very easy to spot. But when there's a little bit of chop on the water, they can be very difficult to spot. We motored the rest of the way back to our marina in flat, calm seas. The only excitement being an occasional fish jumping up out of the water. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave us a thumbs up.